What if I told you that behind a simple act of giving lies an enigma that few have dared to decipher? A secret that separates living faith from mere formality. And that, according to Charles Spurgeon, can reveal the true measure of the human heart. For centuries, millions have repeated the same gesture, convinced they were fulfilling a sacred duty. But what if part of it was just a disguised trade? What few have realized is that there is a fine line between trusting God and subtly trying to bargain with Him, a line that, when crossed, turns generosity into currency and faith into a contract. But there is something that has never been told with full clarity, something that changes the way we see the tithe, the purpose of the offering, and even prosperity itself. Today, you will discover why few truly prosper and how this forgotten wisdom can transform everything. But pay attention. The most shocking point comes right ahead. What if I told you that Charles Spurgeon believed many Christians had turned the tithe into a bargain with God? To him, this practice, so common and seemingly correct, often hid something deeper, a heart that gives expecting something in return. It's as if the offering ceased to be an expression of love and became a transaction, where the giver mentally calculates the spiritual profit they hope to receive. Imagine someone going to the market and, instead of buying bread and milk, trying to buy blessings. It sounds absurd when put this way, but Spurgeon perceived that deep down, many acted exactly like this. And for him, this was a dangerous distortion, as it put God in the role of a business partner rather than a father worthy of trust. Few dare to admit it, but this mindset still echoes in churches and in the hearts of many who claim to give out of love. Spurgeon saw clearly that this is one of the silent roots preventing true spiritual and even financial prosperity. But if this view is true, what does it reveal about us? Before we continue, like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear this truth. You'll understand why the tithe. A short word, yet loaded with centuries of history, debates, and interpretations. Since ancient times, it has been seen as a sign of faithfulness, a practice that has crossed generations and cultures. But behind this tradition lies a silent dilemma. Is the tithe truly an act of generosity, or just a disguised contract? This question shakes foundations because it's not just about money, but about hidden intentions. And what makes it even more intriguing is that the more one tries to answer, the more it becomes clear the issue isn't about percentages, but about purpose. What drives the giving? Fear of loss or the joy of sharing? When Spurgeon addressed this point, he didn't just speak to people's minds, but to their hearts. It was as if he were saying, it's not enough to give. You must understand why you give. And perhaps that's the part many prefer not to think about, because the answer might be uncomfortable. Charles Spurgeon wasn't just an eloquent preacher. He was called the Prince of Preachers for his ability to speak to both the mind and the soul. In the 19th century, his words traveled faster than sound could carry, printed in newspapers, pamphlets, and books that crossed oceans. And most impressively, his sermons are still studied today as if they were preached yesterday. He had an almost surgical clarity to separate human tradition from biblical truth. When speaking about money, faith, and generosity, he spared no warnings and didn't sugarcoat messages to please listeners. For him, honesty before God mattered more than any human applause. This frankness earned him both admiration and criticism. And among so many religious voices, his remained firm, echoing truths that many preferred not to face. But it's precisely here that his view on the tithe becomes even more provocative. The tithe, in the pages of the Old Testament, wasn't born as a mere religious tradition. It was part of the Mosaic law, structure that sustained not only the temple, but also the people who served there. The Levites, who lived solely for the service of God. More than an offering, it was a system of care and maintenance for the work and the community. In that context, giving wasn't optional. It was a social and spiritual duty. Just as today we pay taxes to maintain public services, the tithe maintained Israel's spiritual life and assistance. It had a practical function, but also symbolized the acknowledgement that everything came from God. However, understanding the origin is only the first step. Over time, the original meaning began to mix with human interests and distorted interpretations. And it was here that the line between devotion and transaction began to blur dangerously. There is a subtle danger that can creep into even the noblest practices, turning devotion into currency. Spiritual bargaining happens when someone gives expecting to receive something proportional in return, as if God were bound to a reward chart. In this scenario, faith stops being trust and becomes a kind of calculated investment. Today, this can appear in disguised forms. Someone might give their offering saying, "I'm sowing to get my own home," or "I'm giving so God will open that job opportunity." There's nothing wrong with presenting requests to God. But Spurgeon warned, if the central motivation is the reward, love has already taken second place. This subtle exchange changes everything. Instead of an act of free giving, the offering becomes an attempt to manipulate results, and in such ground, true generosity begins to lose its strength until it disappears. For Spurgeon, true giving doesn't come from obligation, but from the overflow of a loving heart. He said that giving only because it's a command is like offering wilted flowers. The gesture is fulfilled, but it carries no life. The tithe, when seen only as a goal to meet, loses the fragrance of gratitude and the strength of joy. In his sermons, Spurgeon reminded that God's grace doesn't calculate percentages. He pointed to the cross as the supreme example. Christ didn't give 10% of himself, he gave it all. And it's this spirit of total surrender that should inspire every contribution. Thus, the question should never be, how much am I obliged to give? But how much can I give out of love? This change in perspective opens the door to a generosity that knows no limits and, paradoxically, enriches the giver more than the receiver. But few dare to live this way. Modern psychology confirms what the Bible and Spurgeon already taught. Giving out of love produces more joy than giving out of self-interest. Studies show that acts of altruistic generosity activate brain areas linked to satisfaction and lasting well-being. In other words, pure motivation transforms not only the spirit, but also nourishes the mind and even physical health. When someone gives without expecting anything in return, a positive cycle begins. The receiver feels cared for, and the giver experiences a deep sense of purpose. This human bond is far more powerful than any material return. Spurgeon saw in this a reflection of the divine nature. God doesn't bless us to trap us in a contract, but to invite us to live as He does, in constant giving. And, interestingly, when love is the motivation, blessings tend to come naturally, not as payment. But there's still something deeper to see in this subject. Even good actions can be born from wrong intentions. Someone may smile as they give an offering, but inwardly think, "This will secure my blessing." The act looks beautiful on the outside, but as Spurgeon said, God doesn't just look at the hands that give, He examines the heart that moves them. The Bible is clear about this. Each one should give what they have decided in their heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver, 2 Corinthians 9-7. It's not only about the amount or the gesture, but the motivation that sustains it. An offering given out of fear or vanity may help someone, but it doesn't fulfill its spiritual role. This distortion is treacherous because it disguises itself as piety. Sometimes it takes courage to ask oneself, am I giving out of love or out of self-interest? And it's this courage that opens the way to true generosity, free from calculations and bargains. Spurgeon often challenged the mindset of those who saw the tithe as a ceiling. To him, thinking I gave my 10%, now I'm done, was like limiting love. as if affection could be measured with a ruler. True generosity, he said, begins where obligation ends. When someone lives calculating the minimum they can do, they miss the chance to experience the joy of excess in love. It's not about waste, but about abundance. The same abundance seen in nature, where a tree doesn't produce just one fruit, but dozens, hundreds. A free heart doesn't ask, how much must I, but how much can I? This vision is uncomfortable because it pulls us out of our comfort zone. But it's precisely here that purpose blooms. When we give more than necessary, not out of pressure, but out of pleasure. And those who have tasted this freedom know the return can't be measured only in numbers. Jesus was watching people giving offerings at the temple when he saw a widow place only 2 small coins. Humanly speaking, it was almost nothing, but he declared she had given more than all the others because she gave all she had. This is the living portrait of generosity that does not calculate returns. In modern times, there are similar stories, like that of a businessman who, after a financial crisis, decided to help a needy family even without knowing how he would pay his own bills. Months later, he witnessed not only an unexpected recovery, but also a renewed sense of mission. These accounts show that the measure of an offering is not in its monetary value, but in the heart that sustains it. And often, the most precious harvest is the inner transformation that is born in the act of giving. But Spurgeon had a strong warning for those who think they can live this truth with a divided heart. Spurgeon did not soften his words when speaking about giving out of obligation. He said that mandatory tithing, when seen only as a rule, kills the joy of giving. Those who give just to tick the box are not giving, they're paying a fee, he stated firmly. This phrase, simple yet piercing, exposes an uncomfortable reality. When generosity becomes an automatic routine, the living bond between giver and God is lost. The act, which should be spiritual and joyful, is reduced to just another bill to pay. Spurgeon's warning was an invitation to reflect. Does our giving still carry the glow of gratitude? Or have we, perhaps unknowingly, already turned a sacred gesture into a mere ritual? Answering that requires more than honesty. It requires courage to face our true motivation. What if, for years, we've been fulfilling the practice but failing in the purpose? What if our way of giving, carefully repeated, doesn't reflect the essence of what God expects? This possibility is uncomfortable because it doesn't point to others' mistakes. It points inward. Spurgeon knew this was the question that changed everything, because it forces us to look beyond justifications and appearances until we find the true intention guiding our hands. And often, this search reveals that the biggest adjustment to make is not in the amount, but in the heart. Perhaps the greatest transformation someone can experience in the financial and spiritual area is not learning new rules, but rediscovering the meaning of giving. A giving that does not bargain, does not calculate, and does not try to control God. And when that understanding comes, everything that once seemed ordinary gains new weight and meaning. Sowing is an act of trust. It is placing something valuable in the soil and believing that, at the right time, the harvest will come, even without controlling the process. Bargaining, on the other hand, is putting something in the ground while demanding a deadline and a specific result, as if one could dictate the laws of nature to God. Spurgeon made this distinction clear. For him, the sower acts in faith, knowing his role is to plant, water, and wait. The bargainer, however, grows frustrated if the response doesn't come at the time or in the form he imagined. This difference completely changes the experience of giving, because those who sow with love don't measure results only by what they receive, but by the impact they create. And in this type of giving, there is a freedom the bargainer will never know. Now it's time to look inward, not to measure amounts, but to measure motivations. When was the last time you gave something time, money, attention without expecting anything at all in return? This kind of giving is rare because it requires real detachment. But it is in it that faith grows stronger, as generosity without calculation brings us closer to God's character. Spurgeon believed this was the true test of spiritual maturity. Perhaps today's challenge is not to increase the amount you give, but to purify the intention behind it. If your offering were invisible to everyone, would you still give it? Answering that question could be the first step toward deep transformation. Imagine a community where every act of generosity was guided solely by love, where offerings weren't measured by value, but by the transformative impact they create. A church like that wouldn't be concerned with the minimum required, but would overflow with care and provision for all. Spurgeon saw this possibility as more than a dream. He believed that when love is the central motivation, generosity becomes contagious. And in such an environment, even material needs become opportunities to express faith and unity. A society shaped by this principle would see fewer disputes and more collaboration. Finances would be managed not only with calculation, but with purpose. And in this setting, prosperity would not be a privilege for a few, but a blessing shared by many. To God, the size of your offering doesn't matter. What matters is the size of your love when you give. This is the truth that has stood the test of centuries. Because, in the end, He doesn't weigh coins, He weighs hearts. The challenge is to live this truth every day, resisting the temptation to turn giving into obligation. When love is the motivation, even the smallest seed becomes fertile ground. And in that field, the harvest always exceeds expectations. So let every gesture be more than a number. Let it be a reflection of the grace you've received. And the question remains, how big is your love when you give? Because that answer, in the end, defines what we truly offer. Now that you've seen what Spurgeon had to say, the choice is before you. Continue giving only out of habit, or turn every act of giving into a conscious act of love. It's not about fulfilling a law, it's about living a purpose. If this video spoke to you, like, share, and subscribe. The world needs awakened people, and perhaps you are one of them. Now that you hold the key, the choice is yours. Will you use it or let it trust?